Mughals are not invaders, they are simply conquerors of other Indian kingdoms like any other Indian dynasties are conquerors of other Indian kingdoms. Over the 13th century, Mughal armies repeatedly assaulted the Indian subcontinent yet struggled to impose their rule on the lands east of the Indus River. From the 13th century until the early 16th, the dominant power in North India was the Delhi Sultanate, an Islamic empire in the midst of smaller Islamic and Hindu states. Throughout the Sultanate's history, the majority of its agricultural and economic base was various Hindu peoples and minor kingdoms recognizing the Sultan as overlord, its administrative personnel largely Persian-speaking Muslims and its military and rulers made up of a variety of Turkic and Afghan peoples, a bewildering array of ever-changing linguistic, ethnic and religious factions and alliances. Born from the ruins of the Ghurid Sultanate, the Delhi Sultanate was originally but one successor in the Ghurids' North Indian territory, each ruled by a Ghulam, or Mamluk, a Turkic slave soldier. The late Ghurids purchased many Turkic Kipchak nomadic children from the Eurasian steppes, converted them to Islam, and trained them in the arts of war. Like their distant cousins who usurped power in Egypt in the 1250s, these Mamluks were the elite of the Ghurid army and happy to seize power after the assassination of the last Ghurid Sultan. For the 13th century, almost every single Delhi Sultan came from a Kipchak Mamluk background. The Delhi Sultanate was a middling power until it received aid from an unexpected direction, the Mongols. When Chengiz Khan's armies destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, the Khwarezmian prince Jalal al-Din Mingburnu fled over the Indus River. This Mughal-Khwarezmian conflict in India weakened Delhi's rivals in the northwest, and Delhi Sultan Iltutmish, over the late 1220s and 1230s, absorbed the post-Ghurid powers up to the Indus River. By Sultan Iltutmish's death in 1236, Delhi was the great power of northern India and the Gangetic Plain, from the Indus to Bengal, with recognition from the Caliph as the only Muslim sovereign in India, and indeed, one of the mightiest Muslim rulers in the world. But how did Delhi avoid an attack by Chengiz Khan himself? Despite the claims of some popular online videos, they had nothing to do with Buddhism. Several sources, such as Juvayni, Juziani, and the memorial to Chengiz Khan's advisor Yelu Chuke, record that Chengiz wanted a route through India he could use to strike his enemies in China from the south. However, these sources record Chengiz shamans finding only bad omens for a march through India. Yelu Chuke's memorial biography memorably has the advisor interpret the sighting of a rhinoceros, an animal never before seen by the Mughals, as a fortuitous warning from heaven against further forays into India. Some of these sources include the Delhi chronicler Juziani, a record that Chengiz also sent envoys to Sultan Iltutmish. There is no information on what they discussed, but it seems implied by later sources that Iltutmish initiated friendly contacts with the Khan. Several important factors were in place by the end of Iltutmish's life. Firstly was Delhi Sultan's willingness to engage in talks and diplomacy with the Mughals, and seemingly even an appreciation of Mughal military ability and destiny of world conquest, much to the chagrin of chroniclers like Juziani, a refugee who had fled the Mughals to Delhi. Juziani was but one of the many Persian scholars, tradespeople, or Turkic tribes who fled to Delhi lands to escape the Mughals, growing the Sultanate's Islamic element and its military base. The 1230s also marked the Punjabi lands becoming the frontier of the Delhi and Mughal Empire as the Mughals steadily tightened their grip over today's Afghanistan. Relations remained cordial until Iltutmish's death, as his sons and daughters fought for the throne. By the close of the 1230s, the Mughals removed the final buffer state between the Mughals and Delhi. Raiding parties began to probe the frontier in the Punjab and into Kashmir. By 1241 the Mughals took Lahore, though they soon abandoned it. In 1245 Multan and Uch were captured. Sindh and the Punjab were largely under Mughal control by the 1250s. For the next 60 years, Mughal raids on Delhi territory became nearly annual affairs, wreaking great destruction and carrying off prisoners every year. India's general heat and humidity meant most of these campaigns were limited to cooler winter months and were short, bloody affairs. The sultans were firstly fortunate not to feel the weight of a full Mughal invasion. Most attacks were carried out by garrison forces called Tamma, stationed on the Mughal Empire's border. They aimed to destabilize and make small gains but not wash away a state in a sea of blood. This was fortuitous, for Delhi was regularly crippled by fierce succession struggles that hamstrung any response. After Iltutmish's death, only one other sultan died of natural causes in the 13th century, and it took until 1324 for a sultan to be smoothly succeeded by their designated heir. In the 1250s, Grand Khan Möngke sent a general, Sali Noyan, to the Delhi frontier, accompanied by an exiled son of Iltutmish, tasked with enthroning him as the new, compliant Sultan of Delhi. Though they never succeeded, it was a sign of the existential threat the Mughals could pose. From 1249 until 1287, the Sultanate was led by the powerful, keen-eyed Ghiyat al-Din Balban. Initially a Kipchak Mamluk of Iltutmish, Balban made the last of Iltutmish's sons his puppet from 1249 until seizing the throne himself in 1266, after the Sultan and his children all conveniently died. Even before then, Balban had led Delhi's policy to the Mughals. The initial policy rested on the defenses of the border cities, Multan, Lahore, and Uch. While the Mughals were held up in the sieges of these cities, Balban would advance with the army from Delhi. Generally, the Mughals fled the scene before the larger Delhi forces arrived, and Balban would arrive in time to survey the destruction they left behind. While it prevented further penetration of Delhi lands, it was hardly the most effective strategy and was expensive too. To pay for these mobilizations, Balban urged the conquest of Hindu powers in the Doab to use the loot from these campaigns to cover the costs. Important but often overlooked is the stiffness of these local sieges. Inhabitants of Multan, Lahore and other cities, whether Hindu or Muslim, put up spirited defenses, often falling only after heavy losses, with Mughal commanders having to throw themselves into the fray to rally their troops for the task, resulting in many Mughal generals killed or injured. Though the fortifications were pounded down by Mughal catapults, they prolonged each siege and raised the risk of being caught before the Delhi army. Traps were employed. A notable example comes from a siege of Uch in the 1240s. The Mughals breached the walls, and at night a Mughal officer led his men through the gap. But the defenders had dug a deep ditch behind the gap, and filled it with mud and water. Upon stepping onto it, the Mughal officer sank and disappeared. Though the Mughals took the city in the end and massacred the inhabitants, they did so after many casualties. Upon taking these cities, the Mughals undermined the walls. A constant feature of Delhi's reclamations of these cities was having to rebuild the fortifications. Sometimes the Mughals held the sites, resulting in the rare occasions where the Mughals were the defenders against an enemy army. The Mughals would shoot so many arrows from the walls that no bird could have flown by, in the words of the Delhi chronicler Bharani. Sadly, we are not told how the Delhi troops actually reclaimed these forts when this happened. While Vizier Balban recognized the value of diplomacy and had more success here than on the battlefield. Generally, this focused on treating Mughal envoys well or frightening them with Delhi's might. On one occasion, Balban ordered 200,000 footmen and 50,000 horsemen, with all their armor and banners, to greet Mughal envoys as they approached Delhi. In Juziani's telling, the trumpeting of the elephant spooked the Mughals' horses and threw the envoys into the mud. But Delhi's return envoys to Hulegu were favorably received, and likely brought with them expensive gifts, for Hulegu then gave the order for the frontier forces under Sali Noyan to cease their attacks on Delhi, perhaps a reflection of his interest in new allies after Möngke Khan's death in 1259. It gained a few years of peace, but with the breakup of the Mughal Empire in the early 1260s, the raiders attacking the Indian frontier were no longer under imperial power, but the Mughal garrisons and stragglers left in Afghanistan, known variously as the Karaunas or Negudaras. Sandwiched between the Ilkhanate and Chagatai Khanates, the Karaunas resumed raiding the lands of Hindustan. After he became Sultan in 1266, Balban proved an energetic monarch. After many years in the viceroyalty, Balban had moved his allies and friends into prominent positions of power, and thus held the throne securely, helping him act more aggressively towards the Mughals. Like his contemporary in Egypt, Baybaz al-Bandukdari, Balban understood the importance of putting his kingdom on war footing against the Mughals. On his order, the Sultanate retook Multan and Lahore by force, and resettled people there. Balban worked to secure the border with new forts garrisoned by various mountain tribes. After the death, possibly on Balban's order, of the governor of the northwestern frontier, Balban placed his capable, oldest, favored son Muhammad Sultan in Multan to protect the region, who oversaw the repairing of forts and city walls, and of responding to Mughal incursions. Further, Balban welcomed Mughals, Persian, and Central Asian refugees fleeing the Mughal civil wars of the 1260s and gave many military positions, thereby improving the Sultan's knowledge of the Mughalian military. Like the Mamluks of Egypt, Mughal refugees were valuable immigrants, and their flight was welcomed, provided they converted to Islam's. These new Muslims, as the Delhi chroniclers somewhat derisively called them, quickly became an influential political and military component in the Sultanate. Entire neighborhoods in Delhi were formed by the Mughals, who fled there and soon commanded armies and held powerful positions close to the Sultan. Balban understood the threat he faced well. The Delhi chronicles show great anxiety in the capital over the Mughals and present it as the most important task of the Sultan to defend against them. In the 14th century chronicle of Ziya al-Din Barani, Balban lamented that he could not take up jihad against the Hindus, for he feared the moment his army was occupied elsewhere, the Mughals would overrun the frontier. Though few field battles are recorded between the Mughals and Delhi troops in Balban's period, he did not overlook his army. He further expanded the Sultanate's already considerable cavalry arm of both Turks and Hindu horsemen, while fearsome elephants were the stars of the army, even though few records of their use in battle against the Mughals survive. However, Balban's efforts received a major blow when a Mughal attack in 1285 resulted in the death of his favored son and heir. The loss broke Balban, and he died 2 years later. The next few years again saw protracted succession struggles. The most famous defender of Delhi against the Mughals was Sultan Alauddin Khilji, who overthrew his own uncle in 1296. Over his 20-year reign, Alauddin managed, at times narrowly, to repel some of the most serious Mughal assaults on India. A man whose courage was equaled only by his cruelty, Alauddin's defense system was more dynamic than Balban's. He took stronger control of the army and knew he needed not just a great and well-armed host but one always at the ready, given a yearly salary by the state. Yet this would have bankrupted the Sultanate, so to finance it, Alauddin Khilji enacted strict price controls on foodstuff and other supplies. If life for these soldiers and their families was more affordable, the state could pay a smaller wage while still providing for their needs. So, alongside building vast storehouses to control grain distribution in lean or good years while violently punishing those who stockpiled their own goods, Alauddin Khilji and his advisors developed an effective, if complicated, means to keep a great army at a relatively low cost. While the system broke down towards the end of his life, it proved effective for a few critical years. Alongside a growing spy network and bans on the nobility from socializing, Alauddin Khilji secured his internal power from rivals and revolt, allowing him to focus against the Mughals. He better equipped his horsemen and elephants. Like the Mughals, he relied mostly on mobile horse archers, lightly equipped with a powerful center of heavy cavalry. The frontier cities like Saman and Dipalpur were given large permanent garrisons and improved catapults and ballista. He heavily fortified the main route via Multan, repairing old forts and building new ones, while also improving and expanding the walls of Delhi and other cities. The iqtas, or land grants along the Multan route he gave to able-bodied men and generals so that they could quickly raise forces to offer local resistance when the Mughals struck. Despite these efforts, Alauddin Khilji could not dismiss the Mughal threat. The Delhi chroniclers provide few details on the tactics of specific battles, and often simply attribute a victory to divine intervention. Still, the famous victory Alauddin claimed at Kili in 1299 owed more to the sacrifice of his subordinate, Zafar Khan, than any maneuver on the Sultan's part, and only 4 years later, the Mughals laid siege to Delhi itself. Had the siege lasted a month longer before the Mughals withdrew, Delhi would have surely fallen, according to the chronicler Ziya al-Din Barani. Many of Alauddin Khalji's reforms were launched in reaction to the near disaster of the Delhi siege in 1303. Still, Alauddin learned his lessons carefully. Keeping his troops on a constant campaign against Hindu powers built their experience and cohesion, and Alauddin's victories steadily became more decisive. His treatment of Mughal prisoners became ever more horrendous, crushed beneath elephants, their blood sprinkled into the mortar of buildings, and towers of their skulls built outside Delhi's gates. The chronicler Barani reported that some of these skull towers still stood in his time, almost 50 years later. On hearing rumors of a plot by the Mughal inhabitants of the Sultanate, Alauddin responded with massive slaughter, killing some 20-30,000 of the Islamized Mughals in his realm and looting their property. Alauddin's efforts may have dissuaded Mughal raiders, or at least convinced them to turn back when his armies approached. With the death of Dur Khan of the Chagatai Khanate in 1307 and the start of a prolonged succession crisis there, annual raids on India ceased, which Alauddin was happy to claim credit for. But raiding still occurred, with period attacks from the 1320s to the 50s. One of these resulted in the near destruction of everything in Kashmir, and contributed to the rise of Muslim power there. In the end, despite considerable loss and destruction, the Delhi Sultans managed to prevent a Mughal conquest. At times narrow victories, but victories nonetheless. For the Sultans of Delhi, on more than one occasion heaven offered its divine favor to them rather than the Mughals.